Hello everyone, and thank you for joining our session. We've still got some people joining. We've had a lot of interest for this webinar, as you can imagine. I'm just going to hand over in a minute to Richard Edwards, but I just wanted to say a massive thank you for people to register and join the webinar today to hear about the Global Forum for Maintenance and Asset Management Landscape version 3 update, which has been released today. So I'm now going to hand over to Richard. We're going to handle questions through Slido. So you might want to get the Slido either on your phone or on your computer, so you can put things into the Slido, and I'll just pop the code into chat as well. And Richard's got the code also on his slide. So I'm just going to hand over to Richard, but I wanted to say a massive thank you for Richard for joining us today to talk about this. Richard's been on the steering group all the way through this project, and he'll be able to give us quite a lot of insight into what's been going on. So thank you, Richard.
Thanks, Ursula, and hello, everyone. Welcome to this webinar. So I'm going to present to you, it'll be a fairly kind of high-level overview of the changes, but I'm going to leave plenty of time for questions, because I'm sure there will be questions, and if we can't answer them here and now, we will endeavour to go and find the answers. So just in terms of a little bit of context, I've been involved as the IAM representative to Global Forum since its foundation, really, which was about 15 years ago now. And we've, during that time, had 3 publications of the asset management landscape. Each one has had more people involved, and 2 kind of key things come to mind when I'm presenting this in terms of that experience. One is there are a lot of different perspectives to asset management. We sometimes forget that not every industry or culture or country thinks about asset management the same way. And in particular, this latest version has had a very significant number of people involved. So that's meant there's been a lot of different opinions, and not everyone has always agreed. So the first thing I'd say is you might not agree with everything in the new landscape, but it's a consensus and it's a compromise, as asset management itself is often. Trying to get all different perspectives to align on a view is not always easy. So it's a representation of a very rich, diverse background of people and cultures, much more so than the previous 2 versions. That's the first thing I wanted to say. The second thing is, as everyone is aware, asset management is evolving and has evolved a lot in the last 10 years since the second landscape was issued, and it will continue to do so. So by no means is this going to be the final story. It's a point in time, and if people do have strong views on its content, whether they think there's better practice isn't represented or they disagree, there is always the opportunity to contribute to not only Global Forum next version landscape, whenever that will be, but also there's a lot of work going on with the Institute, which we'll touch on at the end, which I'm sure Ursula will be delighted to have your contribution to. So that's just a little bit of context. In terms of, as Ursula mentioned, we're using Slido. That's the Slido code and the QR code. I'll just leave that up for a second if people want to use the camera. We'll gather questions during the presentation, and also at the end we've got a time for Q&A. So please do ask questions. I think there's quite a lot of people on this, so whether we'll get round to them all depends how many ask questions, obviously, but we'll do our best. So Ursula's put the code in the chat for those that haven't managed to scribble it down or take the QR code. So just a lot of people will be aware of these 3 organisations, but there are 3 seminal documents in the asset management world, all being updated this year. And I just, for clarity, wanted to just, for those that aren't aware, just be clear what the 3 organisations are and what they represent. So first is ISO, the International Standards Organisation. They are responsible for all international standards, and they are the body that are responsible for ISO 55000. They have a very structured process around how they develop standards, and each participating country has a mirror committee, and various people on this call, I'm sure, have been representing their respective countries on those. So that's the kind of world of ISO. The Global Forum, I'll talk a little bit more about its makeup, but its purpose is it's an umbrella group. It's not a member society as such. Its members are professional bodies, and its primary purpose is to gain consensus around key aspects of asset management globally. So where we have countries who have multiple professional bodies or members who have operations in multiple countries, we don't have competing ideas of what the fundamentals of asset management are all about. And obviously the IM, hopefully you don't need too much introduction to, given that you're here. But that's obviously the member body that we're representing, and I'm representing today. And as I mentioned, there's kind of 3 seminal documents that are all being updated this year. So landscape, the asset management landscape is what we're going to be talking about today. That's actually officially launched today. I'll give you the details of how you can download it later. It's gone live on the Global Forum website today. Obviously, that has an impact on the asset management anatomy because we're very much aligned with the subject descriptions. So that's been undergoing a review in parallel, and that will be launched in a month's time. I'm not going to say too much about that today. There's a session at the conference next week for those that are going, which will get into a bit more detail about the changes to the anatomy, but I'll touch on it very briefly at the end of the presentation. And then I'm sure everyone's aware the ISO 55000 series, not just 01, but several other accompanying standards and guidance documents are also being published in the summer from August. My understanding is they're not all being published in August, but from August onwards. So a lot of changes for people to get to grips with and understand what impact this will have on them as organisations. So my focus today is on the first. But as I said at the conference next week, we will we'll also touch on the high-level changes in the other 2 documents. So those that are not familiar with Global Forum, as I said, it's an umbrella body. The IM has been a member not since the very beginning, but very close to the beginning. And you can see there the professional bodies from around the world. Sorry. Representing most regions of the world. Obviously, the IM itself has presence in many of those areas where there are other professional bodies, and the Global Forum has allowed the IM to develop relationships with those, so that we can cooperate on events and membership benefits and that sort of thing. So we do have some formal relationships with some of those members. For example, SMRP in the USA, where members can benefit from their bodies of knowledge as their members come from ours. So it's primarily there, as I said, to create consensus on some of the key aspects of asset management and to provide a networking opportunity for professional bodies around the world to meet and align and share good practice, etc., etc. So I won't say any more about the Global Forum as such, other than that as a kind of brief introduction. In terms of those 3 documents, the original landscape was published back in 2011, along with the first version of the IM anatomy. They were both refreshed when ISO 55000 was originally published back in 2014. So there was an alignment exercise there to make sure that both the landscape and the anatomy reflected the thinking that was embedded in the international standard. The anatomy underwent another refresh around 2016. And then about 3 years ago, both the ISO 55000 and the asset management landscape review started. That might seem like an incredibly long amount of time to review a document that's only 40, 50 pages long. But as I said earlier, there's been a real attempt to engage a much more diverse range of people. So that has involved a much more extensive consultation and communications process to achieve that, hence the longer timescales than we previously would have seen. Anyone who's familiar with the IM thinking and materials will be familiar with the structure of what we colloquially call the 6-box model. In Landscape 2, the subjects are aligned with those 6 subject groups that we have defined in the 6-box model. So you see the headings there represent those 6 boxes within the IM conceptual model, and the bullets underneath represent the 39 subjects that are pretty familiar, I think, to a lot of people. underneath those 6 subject groups. One of the kind of design principles that went into the review of this was that we shouldn't be constrained by that structure. That wasn't necessarily where the IM wanted to go, but actually on reflection, it was probably the right decision, because the thinking within the IM about how we conceptualize and articulate the discipline of asset management has moved on as well. So that was kind of up for grabs, as were the subjects and the content based on feedback from members around the world. So the way that the project has been run, the very first phase was to review Landscape 2. That was a reasonably structured process involving members from, I think, 13 professional bodies, and a very extensive set of comments were received based on people's current view of the content and ideas they thought for improving. That was then collated, and the project kind of started in earnest then in phase 2. So phase 2 through to phase 6 has really been responding to those comments, thinking about what changes would be appropriate to respond to those, drafting the content. There's been a technical authoring process, a big emphasis this time on translation. So although phase 6 was translate, throughout this whole process there's been non-English speaking people looking at the concepts and the words to say, do these concepts translate into different languages? Because that was a challenge with the previous 2 versions of the Landscape. So that's been a long and I wouldn't say painless, but a lot of hard work by a lot of people have gone into that process. It kind of brings us to where we are today, and 5th of June being the launch date. It's actually the formal launch was at the SAMA conference in South Africa, that's happening today. We're mirroring that with this webinar within the IM. So as I said, phase 1 of that timetable was a review of Landscape 2, and there were hundreds and hundreds of comments, but trying to distill that down to what some of the kind of key messages were. There was a lot around people wanting better understanding of the purpose of the Landscape and how it fits alongside the international standard. I think sometimes people perceive the Landscape as being an alternative to the ISO, which it very much is not. It's different, it's complementary. So greater emphasis on just explaining that. A better need to reflect the current asset management maturity. Asset management has moved on a lot in 10 years, particularly in areas like digital and AI and that sort of thing, and the document needed to reflect that. There were areas that people felt were not adequately represented in terms of coverage, and that there was a need to broaden some of the subject areas, and we'll come on to that. And there was a view that some of the subject areas were a little bit confusing because they were similar and had a bit of overlap. People couldn't quite understand where one started and the other finished. So there's been some work done to look at that. And then some specifics on the right there in terms of, as I said, information becoming a much more mature discipline over the last 10 years. Some changes around change management, which I'll talk about when we get onto the subjects. Much more about the front end and the back end. So what I mean by that is if you like, the bookends of the asset management process. So purpose and context at the front end. More emphasis is on really making sure we understand what the purpose and context of the organization is before we get into strategy planning, etc. And then at the back end, the value realization, where obviously the purpose of asset management is to deliver value. That's what the definition says, but actually previous Landscape 2 didn't really set that out as clearly as it could have done, so more emphasis on that. So I'll cover the specific changes as we go through, but that was the kind of high-level summary, if you like, of the feedback on Landscape 2. So setting up, there's quite a formal process within Global Forum for projects. There's a scope of work document, and it has a whole set of requirements to make sure we're clear what the purpose is. But some of the principles that were defined as part of that scope was level of detail of being balanced at an appropriate level. So the landscape is very much about defining the discipline, not telling you what to do or how to do it. So it's meant to be high level. It's meant to be a definition of the discipline, not a detailed kind of explanation as to how you apply it in different contexts. It has to be that high level so it works across different industries and contexts and cultures, etc. Simple English, as I said, translation has been a big focus with Landscape 3. Easy to read, appropriate use of graphics. Actually, the decision was made to really minimize the amount of graphics and really stick to the written word. Obviously, avoid conflict with other Global Forum documents and other international documents. And there's been a close eye on the ISO developments as they have been progressing. So quite a few people who were involved in the working groups and the steering group were also involved in the TC251 and the mirror groups around the world. So there was good crossover there to make sure we were not contradicting what we knew was coming through the ISO refreshes. And the way the teams were structured was deliberately, we didn't sort of give a group of subjects to one society and another group to another. The principle was deliberately to mix those groups to get those different perspectives and diversity in at the kind of grassroots level before we kind of rolled up at an international level. So there was a structure agreed for the working groups, which is the 7 areas you can see there. This broadly equates to how the Landscape 3 is structured. The subjects that were within these working groups does not reflect where the subjects ended up. There was a lot of movement around and merging and edits as the process went through. But in essence, these were the kind of 7 working groups which have largely survived as the kind of structure of the Landscape 3. I'll talk a bit about what that means for the IM a little later. As you can see, it kind of follows the logical process of context stakeholders, governance, planning, leadership people, information and delivery, value realization. So what happened at this point was there was a steering group set up and a whole series of working groups. And this is I'll explain that structure in a minute. It's a slightly complicated and challenging structure, but through necessity to get that cross consensus was needed. We've had over 250 volunteers working on the update, and it's really great that 100 of those came from the IAM. So we've had fantastic contribution from IAM members, and we'll acknowledge. We can't want to acknowledge all of those. We'll acknowledge some of the people who were leading those work streams. But thank you from me to everyone who has contributed. It's been a huge kind of collective global effort. So that's been a real positive from this process. As I said, made it more challenging, but has resulted in a much more diverse and perspective on the various subject descriptions. Just to highlight some of the international subject area leads there from around the world, you can see representatives from not all of the member societies from Global Forum were on the kind of steering group. Most did contribute to one or more subject areas, but these were the professional bodies around the world who actually took part in either leading one of those 7 subject group areas or sitting on the steering group to help kind of steer the whole program. So again, pretty good representation. You'll see there Brian Allison from the IAM was leading one of the working groups, and I sat on the actual steering group as the IAM's Global Forum Council representative. Oops. Sorry, just lost me. So in terms of how the program was structured, there was a steerco, which was essentially the Global Forum Council, which is one nominated person from each professional body. So down the left there are the professional bodies. The top line there, the international subject group leads, was the names I just showed in the previous slide. So there was a steerco, which was almost like the kind of Global Forum kind of formal governance sign off, if you like. But the kind of coordination group was that steering group plus all the international subject group leads. So the international subject group leads were selected to lead on behalf of all professional bodies that each of those 7 subject group areas. And as I said, Brian from the IAM was the international subject group lead for subject group 7, their value realization. So that was kind of coordinating at a high level. We then had within each subject group international meetings where each of those professional bodies, if they chose to, had a representative. And that's where all of the work that went on with the individual societies came together for consolidation and review and debate, etc., before it went up to the steering group. We had national coordination groups. So within the IAM, Ursula chaired a session where all of the representatives who were leading from an IAM perspective, the 7 groups came together to make sure that we were joined up across all those subject areas. And then within each society and within each subject group, there was a working group working on the content. So if you can imagine where that little yellow square is, there's one of those in every intersect on that diagram potentially. There's a lot of different people working on this, so quite a big effort to coordinate and consolidate. I have to say I was a little skeptical when I first saw this. I thought this is an impossible task, but it did actually work very effectively. And as I said, it's produced a better outcome in the end. So just to acknowledge the subject leads from the IAM. So we had 2 subject leads. As I said, Brian was the international lead, but we had 2 leads within each group who worked to the international lead from whichever other society was representing. So again, thank you to those individuals who lots of hours and sometimes unsociable hours, because not everyone's UK based, and particularly with the international meetings, whoever the subject group lead wasn't necessarily UK based either. So quite a lot of out of hours meetings there, but just acknowledge all of those volunteers for their efforts, and did a great job in representing the IM and all those 100 volunteers. Some of the challenges: global forum projects are not the easiest things to run. It's like if you've been involved in an IM project with volunteers, it's challenging because people have got the day job. Global forum's like another layer of challenge on top of that. Dave Daines from the Asset Management Council, who chaired this project, did an amazing job of actually holding us to task on delivering to time, and we pretty much have stuck to the original timescales on this, and that was no mean feat. So there was quite a lot of effort and rigor going in behind the background to manage that whole process. Challenges around change management. Obviously, every change we make to the landscape has a knock-on impact to all professional bodies. So really making sure there was a really strong justification for changes, and that we could clearly communicate, and we'll continue to do so, why that's important and what impact it has. A lot of work went into stakeholder and communications planning, a lot of communications through Global Forum itself, but also through the member societies. Authoring and translation I've touched on. Terms and definitions, again, wanting to make sure that the landscape doesn't contradict ISO. So there's a key kind of interface and timing issue there, and the ISO timings were never really 100% clear. So just trying to keep pace and track with that was a challenge, but it's worked reasonably well. And there was a fairly formal process around managing risks and identifying those. So overall, I'd have to say I wasn't involved with the project management of it, but it was a pretty successful exercise, I would say. So when we get to the kind of so what, which is probably what people are actually more interested in, is where we have ended up is there are now 40 subjects within version 3 of the landscape. 18 of those subjects are pretty much unchanged, minor edits to text, etc. 15 of those, there's been some name changes to the subjects and some minor edits, but fundamentally haven't changed. There are 6 new subjects, and I'll run through those in the next slide. There was some cases where it was felt that as I said earlier, the interface between subjects was not clearly defined. There was a decision made to merge some of those subjects, and there were 4 subjects removed. So that doesn't mean taken out of scope, it means the content was absorbed into other subjects. It was felt that they was not in proportion in terms of it being a subject in its own right. So there is a whole process that explains where things have come and gone, which I'll touch on. It's quite a complicated document, but I'll explain how that was done, so that if you really want to know where something's gone from and to, from old landscape to new landscape, it's possible to trace that at a very, almost at a sentence by sentence level. So what does all that mean? As I said, those 7 groups that we use for the working groups are still the structure that's being used within the landscape document, but does not mean that structure is going to be replicated in IAM documents. I'm not going to go into that particularly today. That's the subject of the conference discussion next week. So don't get too hung up on the structure in terms of the 7 groups. It's just the way Global Forum have chosen to organise them. It's up to each professional body how it chooses to organise these subjects to suit its particular models and frameworks and bodies of knowledge, etc. So first one, context and stakeholders. You'll see there that's effectively a group that didn't really exist before. These subjects 2 and 3 there were actually in risk and review before. Quite a strong view that stakeholder management should be at the front end of the process, not the back end. But actually, organisation, purpose, and context is a new subject. So that's an example of one of those 6 new subjects. Stakeholder management, asset costing, evaluation, largely unchanged, minor edits, but moved further towards the front end, which is logical. Second area is around governance. So asset management policy, again, pretty much unchanged. Asset management system was always the kind of missing subject. We sometimes talked about subject 0 when we were talking about the landscape 2 or the anatomy. It was inferred, but it was never explicitly identified as a subject. It now is. Asset management assurance and audit, technical standards legislation, largely unchanged, but moved, structurally moved, but not fundamentally different. Management of change is actually now been split. So organizational change has been taken out of management of change. So this is now change, not anything that isn't organizational change. So asset related change, management of change of assets or systems. But organizational change was separated out. That was one of the key bits of feedback from the Landscape 2 review. Risk, again, it's been moved, the position, been slightly more upfront, but it's as in terms of the scope of the subject, it's not fundamentally different. Asset management planning, this is probably the area that's had most change. So in the old landscape and in the IM conceptual model, this would have been strategy and planning and decision making as 2 kind of groups. That's all been merged into a single group called planning now. So asset management, strategy, objectives, demand analysis, largely unchanged in terms of fundamentals. Sustainable development has been brought forward from what was in the kind of risk and review bucket previously. Strategic planning and asset management planning have been brought together under a single planning subject. And decision making, this is probably one of the biggest changes, where there were several decision making subjects around capital investment, OPEX, shutdown outage management strategy, and resource management strategy within the decision making area before. I'll touch on those in a second, but decision making has all been merged into a single subject area now, which is quite a big subject. So that's quite a big change, and it will have, that has an impact on how we reflect that when we look at the IM documents. Resource management strategy, shutdown outage strategy and planning were previously 2 separate subjects. Each of those, were 2 separate subjects. We had resource management strategy and resource, I think it was management. They've been combined as of outage and strategy and planning so effectively merged into two separate single subjects, if that makes sense. Contingency planning and resilience, not fundamentally changed. Fourth group around leadership and people. Again, some name changes here, but the first four there are largely as they were. Organizational change management is the part of change management that was split out. So it's now a separate subject. And then knowledge management has been added as a new subject. That's the key changes in leadership and people. Data and information, actually, other than configuration management, moving into that area, largely unchanged, other than the content being updated to reflect that there's been a lot of changes in this area, as I said earlier. But structurally, that hasn't particularly changed, other than configuration management kind of coming into that area. Delivery, or what used to be called lifecycle delivery, the first 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 of those are pretty much as they were. Asset repurposing and disposal has been broadened. It used to be asset disposal and asset, I can't remember what it was now. It didn't have repurposing in any way. So it's been broadened to reflect the fact that when assets reach end of life, there needs to be greater consideration about repurposing and the whole circular economy consideration. So that's been broadened. And then supply chain management, again, largely unchanged. And as I said at the beginning, the kind of bookends, if you like, much more emphasis on outcomes and impacts. So we have a new subject area there, which is about, did you actually deliver what you said you were going to deliver? So this isn't just about, are you measuring? Have you got KPIs? Have you got performance management? It's saying, did you actually deliver the benefits, whatever it was, the financial benefits, the safety, the reliability, whatever those outcomes were you set out in your objectives and strategy, did you actually deliver them? And that's a really quite important change. And then continuous improvement has just been brought out as a separate subject. Obviously, it's always been part of asset management thinking, but it's been brought out as a subject in its own right. So I appreciate there's a lot to take in there, and it's a little hard to cover the detail in this kind of webinar, but hopefully that gives you a flavour of the changes. As I said, the way these subjects will be represented in updates to IAM documents, it will not follow this structure. It will be aligned more to the IAM models, and that's fine. I mean, that's just it's not possible to come up with a structure that works for everyone. You've just got to agree to something across the 13 organisations. So we'll see more of that in detail, as I said, at the conference next week. I'm not going to go through this at all in detail, and you probably can't read it anyway, but this is what the configuration management document actually went through. So this is tracing from landscape 2 to landscape 3, where all the different aspects of the old subject maps to the new subjects. So this isn't really intended to be something that would get published, but from our kind of technical committees, it provides a level of assurance. If as we're going through the anatomy, for example, and we're going, well, where's that bit of, I don't know, OPEX decision making gone? We can actually refer to this document and trace through where the different aspects of the wording have moved from and to. So it's quite a complex and hard to navigate piece of work, but it's provided a level of rigor that means nothing got lost effectively, or if it did, it got lost, it got removed deliberately. So that's a document we have, but as I said, it's not something that's intended for wide circulation. It's more for the kind of technical working groups who just want a level of assurance. So just quickly summarise, and then I'll quickly touch on some of what we're thinking about in the IAM, and then hopefully we've got some questions we can pick up. So just to summarise, extensive consultation on Landscape 2 across all of the member societies. I didn't update this slide. Apologies. That should say 250 people from 13 professional bodies involved in the update. Subjects updated to reflect. There's been a lot of thinking and good practice emerged over the last 10 years, and that's been encapsulated. Even when a subject hasn't fundamentally changed its structure, doesn't mean that there weren't tweaks to the content to reflect that. More emphasis on the front end and the back end, purpose and context, and the actual value delivered. The structure has been amended to reflect comments, and the document has been published in English, and it is shortly to be published in those other languages you can see there. Those translations are going on as we speak, so they should be coming out in the next, I don't know, weeks to months, but fairly quickly. They're actively being worked on as we speak. So if you want to download the document, it's been published today on the Global Forum website. That QR code will take you to this page on the Global Forum website, or that web address at the bottom there will take you to the same place. So I'll just leave that up for a second. If people want to scan that, and you'll be able to read in much more detail what I've covered it at a very high level in terms of what's in the subject and what's kind of moved around, etc., etc. I'm sure we can circulate these slides afterwards if people haven't had a chance to scribble down or take a picture of the QR code, but I'll just quickly move on to what this means for the IM. So in parallel to all of that work that our volunteers have been doing on landscape, they didn't realize they'd also signed up to help rewrite the anatomy. So a lot of the same group that we mentioned earlier and acknowledged have also been working and leading the same group of volunteers to actually update the anatomy to reflect the new subjects. And as the anatomy is a much more detailed and rich document, that's been a big task compared to landscape. So we didn't have 13 professional bodies to get consensus across, but there was a much bigger body of work to update. So that document is probably about a month away from completion, and as I said, I will be touching next week on the conference presentation on the 13th of June on how we are aligning the new 40 subjects to the IM various models. So that's imminent, and again, huge thanks to all the volunteers who've worked on that in parallel. But that's not the only impact. Obviously, the 39 subjects is kind of fundamental to a lot of the body of knowledge of the IM. So we're also looking at what impact does this have on big picture, on IM excellence and maturity, and various other guidance documents. To some extent, some of this, some of the changes in the landscape reflect this thinking. So to some extent, it's already taken care of. But in terms of anything that's structural around the subjects, clearly needs to be updated. So things like the SAM Plus tool and guidance will need to be updated to reflect that as well. And then obviously there's the SSGs. So how do we reconcile the current SSGs with the new subject without sitting down and rewriting what's taken us about 10 years to produce? So that's something that is being looked at and prioritized as we speak. So a lot to do, but as is inevitable with an emerging discipline, we never wanted to lock asset management down and say that's it. This shall never be changed ever again because it's too hard. It's important we recognise it's evolving. So what comes with that is the downstream effects of all the work we have to do. But that's the price of progress, I guess, and the fact that our discipline is evolving quite rapidly. So that's the session I'm doing next week, where I'll be touching more on changes to Anatomy 4, and touching also on some of the changes to ISO, although that's not been launched yet, so that'll be pretty high level. So definitely encourage you to join that if you are able to, just as a bit of a kind of trailer. But this webinar was really focused around landscape. So at that point, I'll pause for breath, and Ursula, I am keen to see if we've got any questions or.
Yeah. So we're gonna get Slido up because we've had quite a few questions, as you can imagine. But the benefit of Slido, obviously, people have been voting up their favourites. So I'm hoping that we should. Rob's gonna share. Here we go. So right at the top. Are these in the order of most voted for, Rob? Would be good to have it in that order. Yeah. Okay. So, Richard, you already said we can give a copy of the presentation, and we'll do that because we've recorded this session as well. So when we make the recording available, we'll also make a PDF of the slides available. So that's no problem. We'll manage to do that. So I think we can pretty say we've answered that question.
Yep, that's good. Easy
The
one.
next question, I don't know whether you want to. I mean, you've tried to cover some of this, Richard. I don't know whether you feel like.
So, key difference between Global Forum and IAM framework. I think, as I said, the structure of the landscape is what it is. It doesn't align with the IAM 6-box conceptual model or the 10-box model that has been used within maturity guidance. So the work that's been going on with the anatomy is to look at the best way of aligning the new subjects to that. So we didn't really see the necessity to align with the 7 subject group areas in Global Forum because they were arbitrary to some extent. They're logical, but they're arbitrary to some extent. So I think there'll be more next week on that, but the focus on the IM material will be around what structure works for the IM, but it'll be fully traceable back to Global Forum. So to some extent they are different, but they're just different representations of the same thing, I would say. We've got another one that's just jumped in at number 2.
Yeah, so this is about the value realization area.
Yeah, okay. So there's quite a bit in. So there's two parts to this. Value realization is the kind of did you do it? There's also the did you plan to do it? So there's a lot more in, or there certainly will be in the anatomy because it's much more detailed around value framework. And obviously, for those that have been involved with ISO, value framework is featuring much more strongly in the new version of ISO. So there will be there'll be guidance around how you define value in terms of a framework and how you measure the deliverability of that. I don't think it will go as far as saying what value means because that's organization specific, but it'll provide guidance as to how you do that and typically what one might look like.
And I think it'd be fair to say, Richard, isn't it? I mean, this is even though we will include stuff in the anatomy, there will be more stuff that potentially we need to get into in more detail because this is it's an area that will require some more depth and breadth, to be honest.
Yeah, definitely, and it's a big subject, the whole kind of value framework, measuring value.
Yeah.
Rather handily, another one's just come in at number 2. Apart from having worked across budget, has been the biggest single ingredient of the document. Why? That's quite a hard one for me to answer because I was very instrumental in landscape too. So I'm maybe not best placed to answer what's better. But if I put my personal prejudice to one side, I think it's different perspectives. So where people have changed things that I thought were fine, and I've listened to why people have changed them, and I thought, oh, actually, yeah, that does make a lot of sense. So I just think it's we all know that diversity of opinion gives a better outcome, even if it's harder to do. So I'm not sure I could put my finger on exactly what's made it better. But from my experience, just having listened to some of the arguments about why some of the stuff I originally wrote should be changed, and I've kind of reflected on that and thought, yeah, that's a good point. So I just think more opinions and more perspectives always gives you a better outcome. You can be the judge of that when you download it and see it, but that's my view.
I think it's worth adding, Richard, that because there's more people been involved who English isn't their first language, potentially the document is easier to translate as well. The idea was it would be
Yeah.
easier to translate for other people, and given the fact that obviously it's a global document, I think that can only be beneficial to people across the world, that the document is in maybe language which is easier to understand and maybe easier to translate.
Yeah. So I'll let you answer the next 2.
The diploma and the app. Okay, yeah. So So will the changes in the landscape and the IM anatomy update the IM certificate and diploma exam questions? And if yes, then when? When? So the answer is we will do a review. So every single thing, what we've done is we've gone through every single bit of knowledge we've got, all our knowledge resources. We've also gone through all of our professional development resources, all the professional development aspects. So things like the competencies framework, the criteria for the asset management professional, and we've identified what needs reviewing. So there is an ordering with this because there's obviously dependencies. We really needed the ISO documents to be in the position where they were on the point of publication or published, and the global forum landscape and the anatomy, which will be coming up in the next month or so, to be published. And then we will look at those. We will look at the exam criteria, for example, the syllabus for certificate and diploma, and we will do a review. And that review will then set up a set of recommendations about whether changes are required. I think it's likely that we will evolve the exam syllabus, but it isn't going to happen immediately because we need to do it in a very considered way. And we need to ensure that any changes we do make are beneficial from the candidates who will take the exams, and in terms of helping them with their asset management journey. So we will be doing a review, and we will then take the recommendations from that review to consider what needs to be done in terms of revision. The actual primary document we need to work on first is the competencies framework, and we have been working on that in parallel with the work on the anatomy and the work in the landscape, and all the work that's been going on with ISO. We have been working on the competencies framework, and we are at the point where we've done a review of the things we think we need to change in there. That is subject to us reviewing the changes in the landscape, the ISO, and the anatomy. So there's a bit more work to do around that, and then we will have a set of recommendations. Once we do a revision for the competencies framework, that then provides us a platform to think about the exam syllabus, the criteria for AMP, the criteria for member and fellow, etc., etc. So I've answered. I realise that might be sounded like quite a long answer, but it's designed to cover quite a lot of the professional development resources, and definitely will cover off the AMP as well.
Okay, Rob, that top one I answered earlier. I might have answered it very well, but I tried to answer it. The landscape bad defining, which document talks about how. So from an IM perspective, it's anatomy and SSG, so subject specific guidelines if people aren't familiar. The IIM is another good example of a how to. Obviously, it's not an IM document; it's a NAMS or whatever they call themselves now.
IPWEA.
IPWEA, thank you. But yeah, from an IM perspective, it's the anatomy kind of starts to flesh out what does this really mean, and then the SSGs is much more around this is how you do it in practice. This is case studies as examples. So that's how I'd answer that question. Can versus and look across. I can't answer that question. I'm not familiar with PAS 808, so apologies for my ignorance. That's maybe something we need to look into from the anatomy perspective, Ursula. It's not one I'm familiar with.
Yeah, it's definitely cropped up in some of the discussions, and we can definitely take that away for the anatomy.
Right, next question. When is Global Forum Asset Management Landscape 3 being implemented? So it's launched today. Oh, sorry, I missed one out. I'll come back to that. Sorry, I'm just doing the second one there. The asset management landscape is launched today. In terms of implementation, it's up to each global forum professional body as to how it implements. Obviously, individuals can choose to download it and use it themselves. From an IM perspective, it's live as of today, and we are working towards, as I said earlier, aligning all of our body of knowledge with that. So I wouldn't say you could implement Landscape version 3 in itself. It's more a framework within which to align to. But in terms of its formal launch, it's today, and each of the professional bodies, I think most of those 13 professional bodies, are doing some sort of event today to explain what we've explained here today, but also to touch on what they're doing as individual professional bodies. So in terms of writing exams and content, Ursula's mentioned how IM's doing that. Other global forum members around the world will be doing the same.
I can do the SSG one, Richard, if you like.
Yeah, go for it, Ursula.
Yeah, so we've got a SSG project manager, Steve Bird, and Steve Bird's been we've been liaising with Steve Bird through quite a detailed set of discussions around the changes in the landscape and the anatomy. As Richard said on his slides, we will prioritize new subjects and subjects where there is more change, because actually, whilst, as Richard explained, whilst we do have new subjects and we do have changes in the subjects, the asset management discipline hasn't fundamentally changed overnight because we've issued a new document. And so there are lots of aspects of the existing SSGs which are still relevant. The other thing to bear in mind is quite a lot of the SSGs are more contemporary than the original anatomy and landscape documents. So some of them have been more recently published, and so they've taken it on board some of the newer aspects or the things that the landscape and maybe the anatomy will catch up on. A good example of that is some of the thinking around circular economy and repurposing. You've already seen some of that creeping into some of the SSGs because it's relevant now, whereas it wasn't necessarily something that was in the original anatomy and landscapes.
Wondering if legislative code changes centrally in IM regarding regional. I'm not sure I understand that question.
I think it's about perhaps identifying whether we've got, it's trying to pick up regional differences and changes with legislative code changes. I think particularly with some of the ISO and stuff like that, potentially, Richard. I mean, maybe Mary, maybe you clarify your question and we could maybe make sure we answer it correctly.
Next one is a global landscape international standards true to say that ISO lags behind best practice. So that's a bit of a contentious question. I think the way I'd answer that is the purpose of the landscape is different to the purpose of ISO 55001. In my opinion, I'm not a big fan of ISO creating all this extra guidance. I don't think that's ISO's role, but it's chosen to do so. But for the pure 55001 standard, it's defining the shall requirements for a management system. It's a very specific purpose. The landscape is trying to describe the discipline as a whole. And they're subtly different because you can achieve ISO 55000 compliance or certification and still be a way off world's best practice, almost by definition, because otherwise no one would ever get certified. So the landscape, again, the landscape isn't trying to define world's best practice because that moves all the time. But what it's trying to do is paint the picture. And the word landscape was deliberately chosen because it kind of has a horizon that you can't quite see over. So the landscape is trying to capture the discipline as a whole. So it has a different emphasis to the ISO. So I wouldn't say one lags behind the other. They're different with different purposes. Is the global forum more closely aligned? I think the global forum landscape is more appropriate for assessing maturity as you move towards excellence. So the recently updated IAM excellence guidelines is very much focused around the landscape and the subjects, rather than the ISO, because I just think it's very hard to do that against shall statements. They kind of contradict if you try and do that. So the whole rationale of the subjects when they were originally envisaged back in 2011 was to be able to describe the discipline in such a way that you could assess maturity, that could continually evolve into the kind of currently unknown best practice. You can't really do that with a standard. It's not possible. So I think it's true to say that the landscape is more appropriate, is a more appropriate structure for doing maturity assessments than a management system standard. Limit safe guidelines on assessing loss of management maturity. Not currently, no. There is the plan to update the Global Forum document on the asset management assessor requirements. So there's like I'm sure you call it a competency specification, but it's a specification for what a good assessor would look like to assess ISO 55000. Although that's 55,000 focused, it is impacted by Global Forum. So there is a plan to update that, but there is no current plan to update the Global Forum maturity or the IM maturity at this stage.
Do you want me to do the diploma one?
Yes, please.
I think you'd be safe to say any notice that we will give very ample notice of any changes with the diploma exam. So it's going to take us a while to get through everything we need to get through. We will try and do it as quickly as we can. So my advice to you would be to keep a good eye on what is going on, but we will make sure that we keep people well informed about any changes and make sure you do your exam prior to any changes. But we will need to deal with the transitional period anyway, and we will work with the endorsed training providers and anyone who's booked to do exams to make sure we manage that. Okay.
And then we've probably just got time to answer that last question before we're out. I guess you could look at it like that. The Global Forum landscape is the kind of North Star when it comes to all of the professional bodies that are members of Global Forum, bodies of knowledge and guidance and standards and models, etc. I'm not sure that ISO would agree that the Global Forum landscape is the North Star for ISO 55001. They're kind of different, but I think for our body of knowledge and the various guidelines that come, it's the structure certainly that we sorry, not the structure of the 7 columns, because as I said, we're not necessarily following that, but the subjects themselves. It would be very unhelpful for anyone to describe asset management in a way that wasn't aligned with the now 40 subjects. So yes, you could look at it like that.
I think that's it in terms of questions. We've just got one comment at the end. So I wanted to say a massive thank you for Richard for joining us, and for giving all his insight into not only all the changes that have gone, but also all of the previous sort of history to really help contextualize everything. So Richard, thank you very much for joining us. We have recorded the webinar. We will make sure that it's available to everyone. Thank you for everyone who put in their hands up, their clapping and all the reactions. It's great to see. And just on the final thing, we will make sure that any changes from an endorsed assessor scheme or endorsed training requirements, they'll all be we'll liaise with everyone we need to liaise with well in the time.
Okay, thanks everyone.
Thank you, everyone.